In the autumn of 1872, the quiet farming community of Marrow Creek, Alabama, found itself shadowed by a family name that was spoken with caution. The Holloways had purchased a large parcel of land just outside the town, a stretch of pinewoods and marshland where the soil bled rust red and the cicadas sang like a fevered chorus at dusk. They arrived in a procession of wagons, with livestock tied down and servants trailing close, and though their appearance should have promised prosperity, something in their manner unsettled those who watched. Locals said the patriarch, Elias Holloway, carried himself like a preacher, but spoke with the authority of a man who believed himself untouchable, while his wife, Miriam, appeared fragile yet stern, her gaze quick to cut down any who lingered too long on her daughters. That year marked the beginning of the Holloway legacy, though few in Marrow Creek understood just how deeply their presence would carve into the town's history. The Holloway house rose quickly, a sprawling structure of pale wood with a wide porch that seemed to lean forward into the land, as if listening for secrets buried in the soil. Carpenters whispered that Elias demanded certain rooms be built with no windows and that trapdoors be worked into the flooring of the cellar. His instructions were followed without question, for his money was as strong as his temper, and Marrow Creek was a place where a man's business was considered his own. By winter, the Holloway estate stood like a sentinel on the edge of town, its lantern light visible from the winding dirt roads that led farmers to market. Children dared one another to stand at the edge of the property after dark, and some swore they could hear faint crying carried from the woods. Yet when adults spoke of the Holloways, their words were measured, as though the family's reputation had been sewn into the fabric of silence. The first whispers of corruption came not from the house itself, but from the dealings Elias made in town. He was known to strike bargains with preachers, offering generous donations to the church in exchange for their public blessings, while at the same time ensuring that judges, constables, and land officials received gifts that bound them to his favor. Within months of their arrival, the Holloways had secured rights to waterways and grazing lands that had belonged to struggling families for generations. Men who protested found themselves crushed under debts that seemed to appear overnight, and women who crossed Miriam reported strange visitations, scratches left on their doors, livestock gone missing, and sudden illness in their children. By spring, many in Marrow Creek had stopped questioning the Holloways altogether, for fear that to speak against them was to invite misfortune into one's own home. Yet it was the daughters who drew the deepest fascination. One by one, Miriam gave birth, and every child was a girl. The town joked at first, wondering what curse or blessing lay upon the Holloways that no son was ever born, but soon the jokes gave way to unease. Elias paraded his daughters in church on Sundays, dressed in white cotton dresses, their hair braided tight and their expressions vacant as porcelain dolls. No one saw them play in the fields with other children, nor heard them laugh at the market stalls, and it became a subject of whispered speculation whether they were allowed to leave the house at all, except under their father's watchful eye. Some claimed the girls moved in perfect unison, turning their heads together as though trained to mirror one another, while others swore that when the choir sang hymns, the Holloway daughters mouthed the words, but no sound ever left their lips. The year 1872, then, was remembered less as a season of harvest and more as the beginning of an era in which one family's presence seemed to poison the air of Marrow Creek. Farmers swore that crops along the Holloway borders grew in twisted shapes, while hunters spoke of deer found gutted near the pines, their organs arranged in patterns too deliberate to be the work of animals. Servants who came to work for the Holloways often left after only weeks, muttering of locked doors, sleepless nights, and the sound of something heavy dragging across the floorboards above them. But for every servant who fled, 2 more would be hired, and Elias paid well enough that poverty forced many back into his service despite the fear. The house never lacked for bodies, though the laughter of children and the warmth of family were things rarely felt within its walls. Those who dared question the Holloways in those first months of their settlement found themselves quietly removed from influence in Marrow Creek. A shopkeeper who refused to extend Elias credit found his store set ablaze in the night. A preacher who failed to praise Miriam during a sermon fell ill within days and never returned to his pulpit. Even the local sheriff, a man of iron pride, began to defer to Elias in disputes, declaring that the Holloways were a blessing to the town's growth. Behind closed doors, however, families whispered prayers not for the Holloways but against them, begging that whatever force guided the family's rise might one day loosen its grip on Marrow Creek. But as the calendar turned and the Holloway daughters grew in number, it became clear to many that the family was no passing shadow. They were a permanent scar being carved into the history of Alabama's Bible Belt. From the moment the Holloways settled in Marrow Creek, a strange pattern emerged that no one could deny, though many refused to speak of it openly. Year after year, Miriam Holloway bore children, and every one of them was a daughter. In a time when families prayed for sons to work the land and carry on the name, Elias Holloway seemed cursed or blessed, depending on who whispered the tale, but he wore it as though it were divine design. He would boast that God had granted him a house full of purity, yet the way he guarded those daughters told another story entirely. No one outside the family saw them unattended, and it was said they were never allowed to speak unless spoken to. When questioned about the absence of sons, Elias would smile with a cold kind of certainty, declaring that his daughters were all he needed, though his eyes betrayed a hunger for something no sermon could sanctify. In town, the absence of Holloway boys became a subject of rumor that tangled with fear. Some believed the daughters were the result of a pact Elias had made, a twisted exchange where sons were denied in return for power and influence. Others whispered that Miriam herself had been marked, her womb cursed to only carry daughters because of some sin she had hidden from her youth. As the girls grew, each one resembling the last with pale complexions and solemn eyes, townsfolk began to say they looked like replicas rather than children stamped from the same mold. They were seen dressed alike, their braids tied with identical ribbons, walking 2 by 2 with downcast faces when brought into church. Mothers shuddered to think of what discipline must rule in the Holloway house to produce such quiet obedience, for even the youngest never fidgeted, never spoke, never laughed like a child should. Elias enforced the belief that his daughters were not to mingle with others, declaring that they were set apart, chosen for something higher. He referred to them as his flock, and townspeople began calling them the Holloway lambs in hushed tones. But these lambs did not play in pastures or sing songs in the schoolyard. They were kept close to home, where strange lights were seen flickering from the windows at hours when no lamp should burn. Neighbors passing late claimed to hear chants or the rhythmic thud of footsteps echoing through the hollow rooms, as if the daughters were drilled into rituals beyond ordinary prayer. A few visitors described seeing faint marks on the girls' wrists, as though cords had been tied too tightly, and others swore their skin carried the pale sheen of candle wax, like children who rarely saw the sun. By 1875, the Holloway household had grown to 6 daughters, and still no son was ever born. Miriam appeared increasingly frail, her body bent by the endless burden of childbirth, yet Elias's pride only grew. He declared from the pulpit of Marrow Creek Baptist that sons were a burden, but daughters were vessels of purity, untouched by the corruption of men. His sermons dripped with authority, and he spoke as though his family was proof of divine favor. The preachers he paid echoed his words, cementing his twisted theology in the ears of a congregation too frightened to resist. The townsfolk who once pitied the Holloways now began to fear them more deeply, for if Elias truly believed his daughters were chosen for a sacred purpose, what role could they possibly be forced to play within the walls of that great house? The Holloway estate became a place of dreadful fascination. Servants who worked there spoke of endless rules imposed on the daughters, from silence during meals to hours spent kneeling in prayer until their bodies trembled. One maid recalled carrying water to the upstairs chamber and hearing the muffled sound of crying. Yet when she opened the door, the daughters sat perfectly still, their eyes lowered in unison. The house itself seemed to breathe the weight of their repression, its halls heavy with the echo of footsteps that never strayed. Those who stayed long in Holloway service began to leave in whispers, muttering that the daughters were being shaped into something that could not be spoken aloud, and some confessed they could not look into the girl's eyes without feeling an uncanny chill, as though gazing at reflections of the same broken soul. The town kept its silence, for Elias had tightened his grip on every pulpit, every bench, every ledger that held Marrow Creek together. To question the Holloways was to invite ruin, and so the truth of why sons were never born and why daughters were guarded so fiercely remained hidden behind those pale wooden walls. Farmers avoided the estate after sundown, women hurried their children home when Holloway wagons passed, and preachers offered blessings with trembling hands. Yet the story of the Holloways, daughters only, was etched into every whisper that passed through Marrow Creek, a reminder that some legacies are built not on prosperity or faith, but on secrets buried too deep for daylight to touch. The Holloway daughters became known for their silence, a silence so absolute it unsettled even the most hardened men in Marrow Creek. From the youngest to the eldest, they rarely spoke in public, and when they did, it was in clipped tones rehearsed like lines in a sermon. Townsfolk whispered that Elias and Miriam had imposed a rule of silence within their home, allowing words only when commanded and punishing any sound that broke the strict order of the household. Some servants later claimed that meals at the Holloway estate were conducted in eerie quiet, the scrape of cutlery on porcelain the only sound, while Elias watched with hawk-like intensity to ensure his daughters did not utter a single word. Even their laughter, the natural melody of youth, seemed extinguished, as if it had been stripped away through years of discipline and fear, leaving them as hollow vessels molded to obey. It was not long before people began to call them the choir of silence, though there was no harmony in their presence, only a suffocating stillness that filled any room they entered. In church pews, the Holloway daughters sat lined in a row, their hands folded neatly, their eyes fixed forward with no spark of curiosity or rebellion. When hymns rose around them, their lips moved in unison, forming words without voice, and those who watched said it felt like witnessing puppets pulled by invisible strings. Children dared one another to speak to them in passing, but the daughters never replied, only turned their gazes together, leaving the boldest of boys trembling and pale. This collective restraint bred both fascination and fear, for it suggested a level of control that went beyond parental authority and into something ritualistic, something designed to bind their spirits as well as their tongues. Stories spread of punishments within the estate, whispered by servants too frightened to linger but too shaken to remain silent. They spoke of a small locked room near the cellar where a single chair sat in the dark, and of daughters forced to sit for hours or days when they disobeyed, emerging pale and shivering but wordless still. One maid claimed she had seen Miriam herself deliver the punishments, whispering prayers over the girls as she locked them away, while Elias looked on with approval. Another described hearing chants from behind closed doors, rhythmic murmurs that did not sound like scripture, but like some other language older and heavier, as though Elias had woven his own doctrine into the fabric of their silence. These accounts were never spoken openly in town, for to accuse the Holloways was to invite ruin, but they persisted like a shadowy current beneath every conversation. The cult of silence that bound the Holloway daughters began to reach beyond the estate and into the consciousness of Marrow Creek. Families who lived nearby swore that on still nights, when the wind carried sounds across the pines, they could hear the synchronized footsteps of the daughters pacing the wooden floors, moving in patterns too deliberate to be idle wandering. Others told of flickering lantern light shifting in steady rhythm from window to window, as though the girls were being marched through the halls in ritual procession. The few who dared approach the estate after nightfall reported seeing the daughters standing motionless on the porch, staring outward with eyes that did not blink, their pale faces illuminated in the dim glow of the lamps. These visions unsettled the town so deeply that neighbors began avoiding the road that passed the Holloway land, choosing longer routes rather than risk the unnerving gaze of the silent girls. Even within their silence, the daughters seemed to communicate among themselves in ways that outsiders could not grasp. A tilt of the head, the flicker of an eyelid, the faint movement of a hand, all appeared to carry meaning, as if a secret language had been cultivated in place of words. Servants insisted they had seen the daughters exchange entire conversations without uttering a sound, their gestures flowing with such precision it resembled a performance rehearsed countless times. What was most disturbing, however, was that they always seemed aware of who was watching. Eyes would turn together toward an intruder, and the unspoken message was clear. You had seen what you were not meant to see. Those who witnessed it confessed to sleepless nights afterward, haunted by the image of those silent faces communicating a truth that could never be spoken aloud. By the late 1870s, the Holloway daughters had become an inseparable entity in the minds of Marrow Creek. No longer seen as individuals, they were regarded as extensions of Elias's will, instruments of his strange theology, and embodiments of the silence he had imposed. They were never called by name in town, only referred to collectively, as though their identities had been dissolved into one singular presence. Their silence was not the quiet of meekness or shyness, but the silence of oppression, a silence so deliberate and disciplined it seemed to serve a darker design. Whether born of religious fanaticism, a pact whispered about in secret, or the sheer cruelty of Elias Holloway, the cult of silence endured, and with each passing year the town grew more certain that within those walls, words themselves had become dangerous, forbidden, and perhaps even deadly. The Holloway estate itself became as infamous as the family who occupied it, a sprawling wooden structure that seemed to breathe unease into the land around it. Built on the edge of the Marrow Creek pines, its pale boards weathered quickly into a greyish hue that made the house appear older than its years, as if it had already absorbed too much sorrow to remain new. Its wide porch sagged slightly, despite being recently constructed, and travellers passing by often remarked that the windows never seemed truly dark, always carrying the faintest glimmer of light, even when no lamps were burning inside. Locals began to say the house never slept, that it watched the town as much as the town watched it, and in that watching it seemed to learn the fears of those who whispered about its halls. Servants brought into its rooms reported strange drafts that moved against the direction of the wind, and the constant sensation of being observed even in solitude, as though the walls themselves carried eyes. The structure's heart lay in its cellar, a vast underground chamber dug deeper than any farm basement had reason to be, with corridors branching like roots beneath the earth. Carpenters who worked on its construction said Elias gave detailed instructions, demanding hidden passageways, rooms with no windows, and a large chamber reinforced with beams thick enough to bear the weight of something far heavier than grain. No one knew what purpose such a place served, but murmurs spread that Elias had designed it as a sanctuary for rituals, a place where the daughters were kept when their training in silence was not enough. The few servants who ventured into the cellar returned shaken, speaking of stains on the stone floor that no scrubbing could erase, and of the echo of chanting that seemed to linger in the air even after the rooms stood empty. Those stories fueled the belief that the Holloway estate was not merely a home but a prison, and within its depths lay truths no outsider could endure to uncover. By night, the estate transformed into a theatre of dread. Neighbors swore they saw shadows moving across the second-story windows in patterns too deliberate to be chance, as though the daughters walked in circles under unseen command. Others claimed they heard a low hum rolling from the house, a vibration so steady it resembled the drone of bees, though no swarm was ever found on the property. The surrounding woods added to the unease, for animals avoided the land as if it carried some unseen boundary. Hunters reported that deer refused to graze near the Holloway fields, and dogs brought onto the property whimpered, refusing to cross the threshold. Even the owls that filled the night air with calls fell silent when they neared the estate, leaving an unnatural quiet that pressed heavy on those passing along the dirt road. Inside, the rooms held an arrangement that unsettled even those accustomed to eccentric homes. Hallways twisted unexpectedly, leading visitors in loops until they felt disoriented, and doors opened into rooms with no apparent purpose, small squares with bare walls and floors scarred with scratches. The daughters were often seen standing in these empty chambers, as though waiting for something unseen, their stillness magnified by the starkness of the space. Some servants described mirrors placed strategically in certain halls, tall and narrow, reflecting the girls as they passed, multiplying their presence into 100 silent watchers. The house seemed designed not for comfort, but for discipline, a labyrinth of control where every angle reinforced the authority of Elias Holloway and the rituals he imposed upon his family. The Holloway estate also bore the mark of constant unrest, as if the structure itself resisted the life it contained. Floorboards creaked even when no one walked across them, doors swayed on hinges despite being firmly shut, and the walls carried stains that bled through fresh paint. Miriam was said to wander the halls at night, lantern in hand, her face pale and drawn, pausing at doorways as though listening for sounds the rest of the household could not hear. On stormy nights, neighbors swore the house seemed to glow faintly from within, as though its walls absorbed lightning and held it like a lantern. The estate quickly became the center of whispered superstitions in Marrow Creek, with townsfolk insisting that something unnatural had been built into its foundation, something that fed on the fear it inspired. By the late 1870s, the Holloway house was no longer seen as a symbol of prosperity, but as a warning. Children were forbidden from playing near its fence line, and adults crossed themselves when forced to pass it on the road. Rumors grew that those who entered the estate without Holloway permission were never seen again, their absence explained away by debts or misfortunes, but never fully believed. The house seemed to consume stories, drawing them into its walls until even the most skeptical admitted it carried a presence that defied explanation. In the minds of the townsfolk, the estate had become an entity of its own, a living extension of the Holloway corruption, feeding upon silence, secrecy, and the fear of those who dared to look too closely. The Holloways secured their power in Marrow Creek not merely through wealth and intimidation, but through the careful weaving of influence with those who held authority in both pulpit and courthouse. Elias Holloway understood that to control the town's soul, one must first control its conscience, and so he began his work with the church. His donations flowed in generous sums, enough to repair roofs, purchase new hymnals, and even pay the wages of visiting ministers, yet with each coin came an unspoken obligation. Preachers who once thundered warnings of sin and damnation softened their tones when speaking of the Holloways, praising their generosity and presenting their family as an example of divine favor. It became dangerous to question Elias openly, for to do so was to question the very sermons that framed his legacy, and in a place where faith and reputation were inseparable, the Holloways wove themselves into the marrow of belief. Judges and constables soon found themselves caught in the Holloway net as well. Land disputes were resolved in their favor with alarming frequency, debts owed to them were enforced with brutal efficiency, and when rival families sought justice, their pleas were swallowed by silence in the courthouse halls. Elias was known to arrive with ledgers in hand, presenting transactions and gifts as though they were sacred contracts, and those who accepted his favors quickly discovered that refusal was no longer possible. A judge who dared resist was rumored to have found his barn torched in the night, his livestock scattered into the pines, and though no evidence was ever tied to the Holloways, the message was clear enough. From that moment, rulings shifted toward them without hesitation, as if the weight of law itself had bent under the family's shadow. But it was not only worldly authority the Holloways courted. Darker rumors suggested Elias sought power in places no scripture sanctioned. Preachers whispered that he held private gatherings in the estate's cellar where select men of influence were invited, their attendance marked by secrecy and shame. Servants claimed to hear muffled chants below the floorboards and saw carriages arrive long after midnight, bearing men who cloaked their faces as they entered through hidden doors. These meetings were said to end at dawn, the men emerging pale and shaken, some clutching Holloway documents that secured them wealth or position in the months to follow. No one spoke of what bargains were made in those rooms, but the town felt their reach in every decision handed down from the pulpit or the bench. Miriam Holloway, too, played her part in these dealings, her frail appearance hiding a quiet cunning that unsettled those who underestimated her. While Elias courted judges and preachers, Miriam fostered alliances with the wives of influential men, inviting them to teas at the estate where the daughters sat in silence as though to bear witness. The women left with gifts and whispers of blessings, yet many confessed afterward that they felt more compelled than welcomed, as though declining Miriam's hospitality would invite something far worse. The Holloway daughters were paraded like silent symbols of purity, their blank stares unsettling but strangely persuasive, for they seemed to embody the very discipline the town's ministers preached but could not enforce in their own homes. Through Miriam's quiet maneuvering, the Holloways did not just influence men of power, but wrapped their tendrils into the families that supported them, securing loyalty through both fear and fascination. As years passed, the line between religious devotion and Holloway control blurred so completely that few dared to separate them. Sermons began to echo Elias's own words, claiming daughters were sacred vessels and sons burdensome, a doctrine that placed the Holloways not only above reproach but as models of divine order. Judges defended their property rights as though decreed by Scripture, and constables dismissed accusations against them as the gossip of jealous neighbors. The townsfolk, though fearful, began to absorb these teachings into their daily lives, repeating them in hushed tones until belief itself seemed to twist around the Holloway presence. The family's corruption had seeped so deeply into the marrow of Marrow Creek that to defy them was to defy the very institutions meant to preserve justice and faith. Still, beneath the polished sermons and the smiling handshakes, darker suspicions grew. Farmers muttered that no family could command such favor without making deals beyond earthly means. Women swore that Elias's eyes glimmered with something unnatural when he spoke of his daughters, as though he drew strength from their silence. Some claimed the Holloways had not merely bribed their way into power, but had bargained with forces older than the church, trading away sons for influence, purity for obedience, and daughters for a power that reached from the pulpit to the courthouse. These were stories told in secret, spoken only when doors were locked and lamps burned low, yet they carried the weight of truth for those who had witnessed how completely the Holloways had bent the town to their will. By the early 1880s, the woods that surrounded the Holloway estate had gained a reputation darker than any swamp or backroad in Alabama. Known simply as the Holloway Pines, the stretch of dense trees became a place no child dared to wander and no hunter lingered past sunset. It began with small vanishings, incidents the town tried to dismiss as accidents or wanderings gone astray. A farmhand sent to cut timber never returned, his tools found leaning against a tree as if abandoned mid-task. A young boy chasing after stray cattle vanished into the undergrowth, his cries carrying faintly through the pines before fading into silence. When search parties formed, they came back shaken, muttering about strange markings carved into trunks and the sound of footsteps trailing just beyond the lantern light. Always too many to belong to the group. Those who returned empty-handed began to whisper that the forest itself had grown loyal to the Holloways. The disappearances escalated as years passed, taking not just strangers but people known well to the town. A preacher's niece vanished on her way home from Sunday service, her bonnet found snagged on a low branch near the Holloway fence. A merchant's wife, seen walking along the road at dusk, was never seen again, though her shoes were discovered placed neatly side by side at the edge of the woods. Most disturbing of all was the case of a deputy who went in pursuit of a rumor that Holloway servants were hiding contraband deep within the pines. His horse returned riderless at dawn, eyes wide with terror, but the man himself was never found. Some claimed they heard him calling faintly for help during the night, though his voice seemed to twist and echo as though the trees themselves carried it deeper into the forest. By then, no one doubted that something far more sinister than coincidence was consuming those who entered. Servants who lived on the estate whispered that the daughters were often led into the woods at night, carrying lanterns that flickered like fireflies between the trees. They walked in long lines, barefoot, their dresses brushing against the undergrowth, and when they returned, their hems were damp with dew and soil. None spoke of what they did in the forest, but strange sounds were reported by those who lived nearby, low, rhythmic chanting, the crack of branches breaking in deliberate patterns, and the bleating of livestock that ended in silence far too sudden to be natural. Farmers swore they awoke to find the carcasses of goats and chickens arranged in circles just beyond the Holloway fence, their insides removed with precision. Though Elias denied any connection, his smug dismissal only deepened the suspicion that the pines had become an extension of the rituals that ruled the Holloway daughters. The people of Marrow Creek grew too afraid to confront the family directly, but their unease carved itself into superstition. Mothers warned their children never to step beyond the first line of trees, saying the Holloway daughters would hear their footsteps and draw them deeper with unseen hands. Hunters began carrying talismans, charms blessed by distant preachers, to protect themselves from the whispers they swore followed them in the woods. Some men claimed they saw pale faces between the trees, watching in absolute silence, vanishing when lanterns turned toward them. Others insisted they heard giggles that did not belong to children or women, but something mocking the sound of innocence, echoing in a way that made the hair rise on the back of their necks. It became common to say that the Holloway pines hungered, and that hunger was fed by the family's growing power. As the disappearances multiplied, the town's officials turned blind eyes, their loyalty to Elias secured through fear and corruption. Constables dismissed reports as wanderings or runaways, insisting that no evidence tied the Holloways to the missing. Judges declared investigations unnecessary, citing a lack of proof even when possessions of the lost were found near the estate's borders. Those who pressed too hard for answers often found themselves facing misfortunes that silenced their accusations. Crops failing, debts called in without mercy, or sudden illness sweeping through their households. The message was clear. Searching for the lost was dangerous, not because of what might be found, but because of whom it implicated. The Holloway Pines became a grave without markers, and the town was forced to live alongside its shadow, never speaking its truth aloud. By the end of the decade, the disappearances had woven themselves into the very identity of Marrow Creek. Outsiders heard of the cursed woods and avoided them, while those who lived nearby adapted to the constant dread as though it were part of daily life. At night, when lanterns glowed faintly between the trees, townsfolk shuttered their windows and prayed, though their prayers never mentioned the Holloways by name. The daughters, now nearly grown, were seen less often, yet rumors claimed they led the processions deeper into the pines where no one dared follow. The silence that bound them in church had spread into the forest, and with every disappearance, the boundary between the Holloway family and the land itself blurred further. It was no longer clear if the Holloways had claimed the Pines or if the Pines had claimed them. The sermons of Marrow Creek were once filled with the promise of salvation, the steady cadence of Scripture meant to guide the flock through hardship. But by the time the Holloways had sunk their roots deep into the land, even the holy word seemed powerless against them. Preachers who once thundered against sin now measured their words, weaving Elias's language into their sermons as though Scripture itself bent to his will. The Holloway daughters sat in the pews like pale spectres, their faces unreadable, their lips moving without voice, and the congregation began to sense that the silence spreading through the church was heavier than prayer. Some whispered that the Bible could not save those who had given themselves over to another covenant, and that the Holloways had stepped beyond the reach of salvation into a darkness sanctified only by their own design. In a town built upon faith, the family had become a contradiction, proof that belief could be twisted until it served corruption rather than God. Families who clung to Scripture for comfort found it curiously hollow when measured against the Holloways' presence. Prayers offered for protection seemed unanswered, for livestock still vanished, neighbors still disappeared, and the fear of the Pines pressed down heavier with each passing year. The ministers who should have defended the flock from evil were entangled in debts and favors, their sermons laced with careful praise for Elias and Miriam, as though invoking the Holloways alongside Scripture carried more power than speaking the Lord's name alone. Parishioners left church uneasy, not uplifted, and many confessed to one another in hushed tones that they no longer recognized the God being preached. The faith that once bound Marrow Creek together had become another tool of control, a mask the Holloways wore with such confidence that no one dared to strip it away. The daughters themselves became living Scripture, twisted into symbols of purity that masked the weight of their silence. Their presence was held up as proof that the Holloways had been chosen, that their unusual family structure was a sign of divine order. Yet those who looked closely saw only oppression dressed in holiness. When they passed through town, people lowered their heads, not out of reverence but fear, for the daughters seemed to embody a faith drained of mercy, reduced to obedience without joy. Their very existence mocked the promises of redemption, for if they were indeed blessed, then what did blessing mean but suffering shaped into silence? They moved like verses carved into flesh, a doctrine written not on parchment, but upon their very lives, and no page of Scripture could undo what Elias had already written into them. As the disappearances around the Holloway Pines continued, the people of Marrow Creek sought comfort in their Bibles, but the words rang hollow against the silence that spread like a plague. Psalms recited at night seemed to fade into the trees, swallowed by shadows that gave no echo in return. Hymns sung in church grew weaker, the voices of the congregation faltering when their eyes met the empty gazes of the Holloway daughters. It was as if faith itself had been stripped of sound, leaving only the motions of devotion without its spirit. Families began to fear that their prayers were not unheard but intercepted, drawn into the Holloway estate where they were twisted and returned as curses. The once unshakable belief in Scripture's power began to erode, replaced by a quiet dread that the Holloways had sealed a covenant that no page of holy text could break. By the end of the decade, stories spread that those who defied the Holloways suffered not only misfortune, but afflictions that Scripture could not cure. A merchant who spoke against Elias fell into fits, his body convulsing while his lips whispered verses he did not intend to speak. A mother who barred her children from playing near the Holloway land was found standing at her doorway night after night, reciting psalms until her voice broke, her eyes blank as though guided by some unseen hand. Even ministers were not spared, for one was discovered wandering the church at dawn, tearing pages from the Bible and muttering that the words no longer belonged to God. Each incident deepened the conviction that the Holloways had woven themselves into the very fabric of faith, corrupting it until the people could not tell where Scripture ended and the family's influence began. The name Holloway became less a family surname and more a doctrine unto itself, spoken with the same caution one might reserve for Scripture, but without the comfort Scripture once provided. They were viewed as beyond salvation, their lives proof that some forces thrived in places where holy words lost their power. Marrow Creek, once proud of its standing in the Bible Belt, grew to embody a grim irony, Their most devout community had birthed a corruption so complete that the Bible could not purge it, and prayer could not lift it. In their silence, in their rituals, in their alliances with both preacher and judge, the Holloways had rewritten faith into something unrecognizable, a creed of fear and obedience that no verse could cleanse. In the eyes of the townsfolk, the Holloways stood as the family scripture could not save, a living testament that even in the heart of the Bible Belt, darkness could wear the mask of piety and walk unchallenged among the faithful.